Good evening. Good evening, and welcome to Rice University. My name is Usama Maqdisi, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of History and the first holder of the Arab American Educational Foundation Chair in Arab Studies. I really appreciate your coming out here tonight, especially with the run that's taking place outside and your navigation of the traffic. This is the second in a series of lectures on the Arab world, its history, politics, and culture. The third and final lecture will be held here in this location on the 10th of April, 2008, of course, also a Thursday. Please make a note of the date. The lecture will be given by Professor Lara Deeb of the University of California, Irvine, on the topic of understanding Hezbollah. And the idea behind this lecture series, which began 3 years ago, was to provide a forum for perspectives on the Arab world and from the Arab world that give American students at Rice some sense of the richness of the history of the Arab world and the diversity therein. I'd like to thank the sponsors of this series, the Department of History, the Boniak Center for the Advancement of Religious Tolerance, the Arab American Educational Foundation, and especially the James A. Baker III Institute for Public Policy, whose staff have been very helpful and who are recording and webcasting this event. It's with pleasure that I introduce Professor Joseph Massad from Columbia University. Joseph is a friend and a colleague. He received his PhD from Columbia in 1998, and he's currently an associate professor there in modern Arab politics and intellectual history in the Department of Middle East Languages and Cultures at Columbia University. In the space of a decade, Joseph has marked himself as a leading scholar of Arab culture of his generation. He is at once a historian, a political scientist, and a literary critic. And he excels in all three disciplines. He has lectured across the United States, across Europe, and across the Middle East. He writes a regular column in the Egyptian Al-Ahram Weekly and also contributes to newspapers in the Middle East, such as the Lebanese Al-Akhbar and also the London-based Al-Hayat. But Joseph is first and foremost a scholar. His first book was the well-received Colonial Effects. It was entitled Colonial Effects. It was published by Columbia University Press, and it was a history of the creation and formation of colonial and post-colonial Jordan and Jordanian identity. His second book was a collection of essays published in 2006 entitled The Persistence of the Palestinian Question and published by Routledge. His third and most recent book, which has just been published by the University of Chicago Press, is entitled Desiring Arabs, and it's got an amazing cover, which I want to show you. I think the cover alone is worth the book, although of course you must read the entire book. The cover alone, it's really a striking cover, a beautiful cover, and a remarkable book. It's a book not simply about Orientalist notions of Arab sexuality, but far more originally and far more strikingly, it's about how Arab writers, how Arab societies, both liberal, secular, and Islamist, have internalized these Western stereotypes and have constructed notions of proper sexual mores which have very little in common with what Joseph shows as the actual, more complex and richer history of the Arab world. And he'll be speaking about this book tomorrow at a seminar organized by the Center for the Study of Women, Gender, and Sexuality here at Rice. It'll be obvious to anyone who knows Joseph, who has read his works, who has Googled him on the internet, that Joseph has been profoundly influenced by the late Edward Said, one of the most significant intellectuals of the 20th century, and in interests of honest disclosure, he happened to be my uncle. Edward Said, of course, taught at Columbia until 2003, and at that time and during that time, he took Joseph, who had received his undergraduate degree and his MA from the University of New Mexico, under his wing. He also baptized Joseph into the ferocious politics of Middle Eastern studies in the United States. So although Joseph is, by all accounts, a leading scholar of international standing, although he is the author of 3 books, 2 with major academic presses, Although he is the writer of dozens of refereed articles which have won praise from leading fellow academicians, Joseph has been subjected to an extraordinary campaign of vilification over the past several years. He has been accused of all sorts of things, from anti-Semitism to intimidating his students to being a bully, accusations that have been leveled primarily by vehement, partisan, self-styled pro-Israel, non-university groups who can't stand his political views. Groups such as the Boston-based David Project and, of course, Campus Watch. They don't like what Joseph says. They don't like what he thinks. They don't want to debate him. They want to silence him. Although he has fought incredibly hard to clear his name, Joseph's travails are, unfortunately, not yet over. Other untenured professors across this country are now being subjected to similar campaigns of intimidation and defamation, campaigns that ultimately subvert one of the most fundamental principles of American universities, namely academic freedom. Tonight, therefore, I especially welcome Joseph Massad, Professor Massad, to Houston and to Rice, not simply because he is supposedly controversial, which is an appellation I think best reserved for those fomenting controversy as opposed to those being vilified by it, but because Joseph is quite simply a leading Arab intellectual. The title of his lecture tonight is Semitism and the Palestinians. Professor Massad will speak for roughly 40 minutes, and then we'll take questions directly from the audience. Please join me in turning off your cell phones and in welcoming Professor Joseph Massad.
Thank you very much for this generous introduction, Usama. I hope I can live up to just a few of the nice things you've said about me. Thank you all for coming this evening. I'd like to note and signal before I begin my lecture that today is Edward Said's birthday, and of course, his influence not only on my work but on a large amount of disciplines, including, of course, Palestinian studies, is immense. I will be sort of quoting from him. I will be citing him sort of much into tonight's lecture, primarily because I've learned much from what he had to teach all of us on the Palestinian question, and also perhaps as a way of paying homage to him today on his birthday. What is Semitism, and what does it have to do with the Palestinians? What is the relationship that Palestinians have to Semitism, to the Semite? Does the history of Semitism have anything to do with Palestinians? If so, what is that history? We know much about anti-Semitism and how in popular European and American understanding it has much to do with the Jews as victims of it. Increasingly, the Euro-American depiction has it that Arabs, and often Palestinians, are perpetrators of it. But what is this Semitism that anti-Semitism is opposed to, that it wants to persecute, to oppress? Are Palestinians opposed to Semitism, to the Semites? And if so, why would they oppose them? Are they in fact victims or perpetrators of Semitism or of anti-Semitism? When Edward Said embarked on his study of Orientalism, he explained, and I quote him, that by almost an inescapable logic, I have found myself writing the history of a strange, secret sharer of Western anti-Semitism. That anti-Semitism and Orientalism resemble each other very closely is a historical, cultural, and political truth that needs only to be mentioned to an Arab Palestinian for its irony to be perfectly understood, unquote. The category of the Semite was invented by European philologists in the 18th century and was transformed by the 19th from a linguistic into a racial category. Ernest Renan was perhaps one of the most illustrious Orientalists who helped to bring about this transformation. For Renan, the Semitic spirit had two forms, what he called the Hebraic or Mosaic form and the Arabic or Islamic form. Indeed, according to such representations, as Said summarizes them, the Semites are rabid monotheists who produced no mythology, no art, no commerce, no civilization. Their consciousness is a narrow and rigid one. All in all, they represent, and here we quote Renan, an inferior combination of human nature, unquote. For Renan, who lived in the 19th century and wrote primarily between the 1850s and 1880s, for him and for Semitic studies, or Semitics as it was called, the Jew, and I quote him, is like the Arab, and vice versa. The construction of the Semite was, of course, a ruse for the invention of the Indo-European, not only in philological terms, but specifically in racial terms, when the Indo-European becomes the Aryan. Shot through with social Darwinism and evolutionist criteria, the Arab and the Jew were seen as manifestations of evolutionary arrest. This is how Said describes how Semiticists represented both groups. I quote him again. In no people, more than in the Oriental Semites, was it possible to see the present and the origin together. The Jews and the Muslims, as subjects of Orientalist study, were readily understandable in view of their primitive origins. This was, and to a certain extent still is, the cornerstone of modern Orientalism. Renan had called the Semites an instance of arrested development, and functionally speaking, this came to mean that for the Orientalist, no modern Semite, however much he may have believed himself to be modern, could ever outdistance the organizing claims on him of his origins. End of quote. The conflation of Arab and Jew on account of philological and racial criteria was not, however, confined to Semitics. This was a much more protracted phenomena that would inform European culture more broadly. When describing a young Jewish boy in À la recherche du temps perdu, Marcel Proust would write without irony how he looked, and I quote Proust here, he looked so like the Bellini portrait of Muhammad II. It's an astonishing likeness. He has the same arched eyebrows and hooked nose and prominent cheekbones. When he has a little beard, he will be Muhammad himself, unquote. This identity between Jews and Arabs was not only made by Europeans hostile to the two groups, or even by those hostile to one of them, but also by people and thinkers who thought it an objective racial criterion to be traced back to biblical and Quranic genealogy. Indeed, the Orientalist Louis Massignon, generally considered friendly to both Arabs and Jews, and who supported the Palestinian struggle against Zionism, would identify the colonial situation on the ground as late as 1960 with reference to Semitism. He says, I think that for the problem of the future of the Arabs, it must be found in Semitism. I think that at the base of the Arab difficulties, there is this dramatic conflict, this fratricidal hatred between Israel and Ishmael. The Arabs find themselves in collision with it in the claim of exclusivity among the Semites, the privileged Semites of the right. They, the Arabs on the contrary, are the outlaws, the excluded, unquote. The development of the Semitic idea was such that Jews and Arabs came to identify themselves as Semites. But if the designation of people as Semites was precisely a ruse for the designation of their superior other as Aryan, Semitism begins to look indistinguishable from anti-Semitism. The act of inventing the Semite is the very act of inventing the carrier of that identity as other. It is indeed the act of creating the anti-Semite. In this light, Semitism has always been anti-Semitism. Let us now turn to Semitism and the Jews as an entry point to understanding how Palestinians would figure in this history. In the last century and a half, many have tried to explain the persistence of the Jewish question, which has always been entangled with the persistence of anti-Jewish sentiment across Western history. In light of Semitics, and based on its taxonomies, this sentiment, whether based on religious, social, ethnic, geographic, linguistic, or racial grounds, clustered together in the 19th century in a full-fledged othering ideological edifice that identified itself as anti-Semitism. In contrast with Semitism, which was invented by a certain class of intellectuals that were scholars and philologists, anti-Semitism was invented by intellectuals in the political and journalistic professions. The term was coined in 1879 by a minor Viennese journalist by the name of Wilhelm Marr, and would first appear as a political program titled The Victory of Judaism over Germanism. Marr was careful to decouple anti-Semitism from the history of Christian hatred of Jews on the basis of religion, emphasizing, in line with Semitics and racial theories current at the time, that the distinction to be made between Jews and Aryans is strictly racial. 19th and 20th century thinkers have advanced a number of analyses and proposals to resolve what was called then the Jewish question. Karl Marx postulated that the Jewish question would be resolved alongside human emancipation, which required the ending of the division between humans as egotistical beings inhabiting civil society and humans as abstract citizens in the realm of the state, as Marx put it. But as such emancipation failed to materialize, 20th century authors with as widely differing views as Sigmund Freud, Hannah Arendt, Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Isaac Deutscher, Abraham Léon, and Jean-Paul Sartre attempted to analyze the basis of this anti-Jewish sentiment across the ages, with most concentrating on the new ideology of anti-Semitism that emerged within the belly of Romantic modernity. Their answers ranged from psychosexual explanations to socioeconomic ones. Adorno and Horkheimer argued in their classic The Dialectic of Enlightenment that Enlightenment had done away with the dialectic and posited itself as the end of history, and then sought to control everything totalistically. In so doing, Jews were posited and projected by anti-Semites as a negative principle. Thus, Enlightenment transformed itself into the nightmare of Nazism and democratizing capitalism. Léon turned to Marxian economics and posited historical Jews as a people class made necessary by Christian European economics. Freud, among other things, identified the horror felt by Christian boys when they hear of the circumcision of Jewish boys, which they interpret as castration, as one of the reasons for the contempt they feel for Jewish men. Others saw the very basis of Gentile identity as necessitating the hatred of the Jew, wherein Sartre's thesis that, quote, if the Jew did not exist, the anti-Semite would invent him, tops the list. Notwithstanding Sartre's reduction of the Jew to an object of Gentile hatred lacking agency, his important thesis linked the persistence of the Jewish question to the persistence of anti-Semitism. The European Renaissance had been predicated on a rejection of the recent European barbarism. This negative assessment of what came to be known later as the Middle Ages motivated Renaissance and later Enlightenment thinkers to attempt to invent a heroic, glorious past by appropriating Greek civilization and incorporating it into the recently invented Europe. This process was parallel to Protestantism's appropriation of the Hebrew Bible in ways that the Catholic Church had previously shunned. European colonialism, having learned the lessons of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, was going to impart to all the colonized a similar cultural self-rejection, commonly known sometimes as self-hatred, calling for the adoption of enlightened European Christian culture as model. While colonialism began to rule over peoples and cultures it had othered a priori, Jews living in Europe had experienced this othering for a much longer time, albeit intermittently. The Jewish Haskalah, or Enlightenment, emerged within this European history of self-rejection and reinvention as an assimilationist project seeking to transform Jewish culture from something identified by post-Enlightened Europe as non-European, if not un-European, into something more in line with the newly invented image of Europe and its Enlightenment. Indeed, Moses Mendelssohn's famous book, Jerusalem, was seen by many as an attempt to transform Judaism into a form of enlightened Christianity, leading many of his critics to call upon him to take the extra step and convert. He did not, but his children did. Reform Judaism, a German innovation, would pick up the mantle of Christianizing Judaism in the middle of the 19th century. The rejection of things Jewish in favor of things European were to define much of the Haskalah project, which saw in assimilation the final integration of an othered Jewry into the new European self. While the project seemed successful in a number of ways, especially in Germany and France, and less so in unenlightened Eastern Europe, it ultimately led to official Christianization through formal conversions. Indeed, Theodor Herzl himself, a mere 3 years before launching the Zionist project, which was to serve as a mild corrective to the Haskalah, had proposed the mass baptism of European Jews to Catholicism in a now famous proposal that he made to the Pope. Zionism, like the Haskalah, adopted European, especially German, Enlightenment thought as its evaluative mode of assessing Jewishness and Judaism, and sought their transformation into European Enlightenment. It was not that the anti-Semites were wrong, that Jews had, and I quote, bold, misshapen noses, furtive and cunning eyes, unquote, as Theodor Herzl described French Jews, for example, or that these Jews spoke a debased German that was nothing less than, quote, the stealthy tongues of prisoners, as Herzl described it in Der Judenstaat, but rather that the anti-Semites did not offer a solution to this despicable Jewish condition, according to Herzl. Zionism, which espoused these views of Jews, while conscious of their anti-Semitic pedigree, simply wanted to rid Jews of such traits and teach them how to be Europeans. While Zionism espoused the goals of the Haskalah thinkers, sometimes referred to as Maskilim, and other Jewish assimilationists in its understanding that the mark of Jewish otherness had to be removed, it differed from both in affirming that the attempt by Jews to prove that they could become Europeans inside Europe would not be allowed by European Christians, as the question for them had ceased to be religious and had become racial. The solution seemed self-evident. Zionism, in Herzl's words, would set up a state for the Jews that would constitute, and I quote him, the portion of the rampart of Europe against Asia, an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism, unquote. The state, as Herzl's novel Altneuland uncovered, would outdo the Europeans at their own game of civilization. The settler colony was going to be the space of Jewish transformation. To cease being Semitic and become European, Jews must exit Europe. They could return to it and become part of it by emulating its culture at a geographical remove. If Jews were Asians in Europe, in Asia they will become Europeans. Herzl affirms that it is not a question of taking Jews away, quote, from civilized regions into the desert, but rather that the transformation will be carried out in the midst of civilization. He declares, we shall not revert to a lower stage, we shall rise to a higher one. In the new settler colony, Jews would no longer be dirty, cunning, parasitical, lazy, superstitious, weak, effeminate, as anti-Semitism and Zionism posited them, but would become hardworking, scientifically minded, strong, rational, clean, and civilized. In short, European. It is in adopting nationalism as the solution, or more precisely, dissolution, of the Jewish question that Zionism assimilated the most important form of political life unleashed by the French Revolution. If Semitism and anti-Semitism insisted that the Jews were not Aryan or European, that they were a separate race and a separate nation, Zionism could not agree more. Upon encountering the Palestinian Arabs, Zionism's transformative project expanded. While it sought to metamorphose Jews into Europeans by desemitizing them, it set in motion a historical process by which it was to metamorphose Palestinian Arabs into Jews in a displaced geography of anti-Semitism. This move would also guarantee that the figure of the Semite would be preserved, but would be identified solely with the Arab. The ultimate project of cultural transformation that Zionism embarked upon, then, was the metamorphosis of the Jew into the anti-Semite, which Zionism understood correctly to be the ultimate proof of its Europeanness. The Jewish Holocaust only served to strengthen this belief by Zionism, which insisted that only those Jews who answered its transformative call in its settler colony escaped the fate that befell Jews who insisted on their diasporic or Semitic condition. But Zionism's project would prove twofold. In transforming the Jew into the anti-Semite, it became necessary to transform the Palestinian Arab into the disappearing European Jew. But how was this transformation effected? It is at the juncture of Semitism that Said located his intervention. He asserts, and I quote him, that what has not been sufficiently stressed in histories of modern anti-Semitism has been the legitimation of such atavistic designations by Orientalism, and the way this academic and intellectual legitimation has persisted right through the modern age in discussions of Islam, the Arabs, or the Near Orient. Unquote. The way Jew and Arab as Semites register in the West was best exemplified for Said in another astute aside by Proust, not unrelated to the one I quoted above. Said quoted Proust thus: "The Romanians, the Egyptians, the Turks may hate the Jews, but in a French drawing room, the differences between these people are not so apparent, and an Israelite making his entry as though he were emerging from the heart of the desert, his body crouching like a hyena's, his neck thrust obliquely forward, spreading himself in proud salams, completely satisfies a certain taste for the Oriental." Unquote. In his book Semites and Anti-Semites, the infamous and definitely controversial Orientalist Bernard Lewis states, and I quote him, that the argument is sometimes put forward that the Arabs cannot be anti-Semitic because they themselves are Semites. Such a statement is self-evidently absurd, and the argument that supports it doubly flawed. First, the term Semite has no meaning as applied to groups as heterogeneous as the Arabs or the Jews, and indeed, it could be argued that the use of such terms is in itself a sign of racism and certainly either of ignorance or bad faith. Unquote. I actually fully agree with Lewis, and I add that the same can be said about the Jews. Indeed, to echo Lewis, the argument that is sometimes made that the Jews cannot be anti-Semitic because they themselves are Semites can be equally refuted on the same grounds. Lewis, however, adds a qualifier to make the use I have just made of his argument untenable. He maintains that the second reason this argument is flawed is that, quote, anti-Semitism has never anywhere been concerned with anyone but Jews and is therefore available to Arabs as to other people as an option should they choose it, unquote. In fact, as we saw already, and as we will see elaborated below, anti-Semitism has been made available to those Jews who seek to other themselves and assimilate into European Christian normativity by repudiating the Semite within, namely their Jewishness, and the Semite without, namely the Arabs. As such, anti-Semitism is equally available to the Jews as it is available to the Arabs. In the first half of the 20th century, anti-Semitism would continue to focus on the figure of the Jew, while colonial Orientalism would limit its focus to the Arab as a Semite of choice. In the wake of the Nazi Holocaust and the end of colonialism, both would retreat significantly, but only temporarily. Soon, anti-Semitism and Orientalism would re-emerge with one main racialized Semitic object, the Arab. This transformative moment in Europe and America, which took place during and after the '67 war, would gain momentum quickly, so much so that in the wake of the 1973 war and the oil embargo, Arabs, as Said observed, came to be represented in the West as having, and I quote Said, as having clearly Semitic features, sharply hooked noses, the evil mustachioed leer on their faces, were all obvious reminders to a largely non-Semitic population that Semites were at the bottom of all our troubles, which in this case is principally a gasoline shortage. The transference of popular anti-Semitic animus from a Jewish to an Arab target was made smoothly, since the figure was essentially the same, unquote. Here Said begins with the history of anti-Semitism to illustrate his findings about the history of the Arab, and specifically the Palestinian. To clarify what he means, Said states that in depicting the Arab as a negative value and as a disruptor of Israel's and the West's existence, as a surmountable obstacle to Israel's creation in 1948, what Orientalist and anti-Semitic representations result in is a certain conception of the Arab that is ontologically linked to the Jew. Said says, the Arab is conceived of now as a shadow that dogs the Jew. In that shadow, because Arabs and Jews are Oriental Semites, can be placed whatever traditional latent mistrust a Westerner feels towards the Oriental. For the Jew of pre-Nazi Europe has bifurcated. What we have now is a Jewish hero constructed out of a reconstructed cult of the adventurer, pioneer, Orientalist, and his creeping, mysteriously fearsome shadow, the Arab Oriental, unquote. In these remarks, what Said is gesturing towards is the endemic anti-Semitism that plagues all representations of Arabs today. Indeed, the very displacement of the object of anti-Semitism from the Jew onto the Arab. If anti-Semites posited Jews as the purveyors of corruption, as financier bankers who control the world, as violent communist subversives, and as poisoners of Christian wells, the Arab and the Muslim today are seen as in control of the oil market and therefore of the global financial market, the purveyors of hatred and corruption of civilized Christian society, as violent terrorists and as possible mass murderers, not with some Semitic poison, but with nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, which are yet to be found. Thus, Michael Moore feels vindicated in telling us in his film Fahrenheit 9/11 about the portion of the American economy controlled by Saudi money, while neglecting to mention the much, much larger American share of the Saudi economy. In light of Said's work, one cannot understand Orientalism, the Arab, and ultimately the Palestinian without understanding European Jewish history and the history of European anti-Semitism and the context of European colonialism, which made and make all these historical transformations possible and mobilize the very discourse that produces them as facts. To analyze the condition of the Palestinians, one must begin with European Jews. And to analyze the history of European Jews in modernity, one must begin with the history of anti-Semitism. It is in beginning from these various historical junctures that we can see the emergence of Zionist ideology as a particular brand of Orientalism and therefore of anti-Semitism in the context of Europe's colonial project. Said maintains that, quote, by a concatenation of events and circumstances, the Semitic myth bifurcated in the Zionist movement. One Semite went the way of Orientalism, the other, the Arab, was forced to go the way of the Oriental, unquote. It is in reading the history of Palestine, of the Palestinians, in conjunction with the history of European Jews, that we can explain how Zionist ideology was able to describe Arabs using the same anti-Semitic vocabulary deployed against Jews. It is this reading that allows Said to see that Chaim Weizmann's anti-Arab racism makes sense only in the context of European colonial history. For Said, and I quote him, the common denominator between Weizmann and the European anti-Semite is the Orientalist perspective, seeing Semites as by nature lacking the desirable qualities of Occidentals, unquote. This common denominator between Zionism and anti-Semitism in the era of colonialism is what produces the Palestinian as the Jew. So much that in his resistance to foreign colonialists, the Palestinian was either, as Said explains to us, a stupid savage or a negligible quantity, morally and even existentially. Said understood Jewish intellectual history as a history of outsiders who effected crucial critiques of European Christian society, and was saddened by Zionism's continuing attempts to suppress this Jewish tradition by transforming it into a kind of worship of the State of Israel. The contemporary refusal of most Jews to begin again from a position of critique of Zionism, indeed the insistence on beginning again with it, has led to the disappearance of the European Jew as a meaningful ontological category. In this sense, and in line with his understanding of Zionism's displacement of the Jew onto the Palestinian, which was both an ontological and an epistemological reordering, Said told the Israeli newspaper Haaretz that he considered himself the last Jewish intellectual. Following Said's important gesture, it becomes possible for us to look at the struggles over Palestine in tandem with one another. If beginning with the modern history of European Jews, one also begins with the history of anti-Semitism, then by beginning with the history of Zionism, one begins with the history of the transformation of the Palestinian into the Jew. Herein lies the transformed relationship of the Palestinian to Semitism. The dislocation of the Palestinians, their dispossession and alienation from their geography, their transformation into wandering and besieged Jews, are made up of the very details of the Palestinian experience. This is how Said describes Palestinian lives. The stability of geography and the continuity of land, these have completely disappeared from my life and the life of all Palestinians. If we're not stopped at borders, or herded into new camps, or denied re-entry and residence, or barred from travel from one place to another, more of our land is taken, our lives are interfered with arbitrarily, our voices are prevented from reaching each other, our identity is confined to frightened little islands in an inhospitable environment of superior military force, sanitized by the clinical jargon of pure administration. In a Western context, Said understood intimately the racial game of civilization that gave merit to the suffering of the civilized and indifference to the barbarians. He understood that the history that transformed the Jew into the Gentile and the Palestinian into the Jew is made up of new interpretations of the history of anti-Semitism, wherein anti-Semitism had to revise its target from the now transformed Jew onto the transformed Palestinian. He avers in this regard, Said does, that we have no known Einsteins, no Chagall, no Freud or Rubinstein to protect us with a legacy of glorious achievements. We have had no Holocaust to protect us with the world's compassion. We are other and opposite, a flaw in the geometry of resettlement and exodus, unquote. Thus, as the new Jews, Palestinian lives must replicate the past of their oppressors. It is there that the varying Palestinian relationship to Semitism is located. In encouraging Zionism, the Palestinians as Arabs in encountering Zionism, the Palestinians as Arabs were transformed from one kind of Semite that was the object of Orientalist othering and racialization into another kind of Semite on whom is displaced the representative and oppressive othering of anti-Semitism. If, as Said's finding has it, Zionism sent Jews the way of Orientalism and the Arabs the way of the Oriental, we can add that it also sent them the way of the Jew as Semite. Therein lies the essence of the Palestinian relationship to Semitism. Today, as Arabs and as Jews, Palestinians have become the quintessential Semites. Thank you.
Joseph will be happy to take questions. As always in these forums, please keep your questions to the point and brief, and allow the speaker a chance to respond.
Yes.
Apparently,
Raise your voice, please.
the Arabs and Muslims always operate on a 10 to 30 year time delay. That I believe this anti-Semitism, Semitism, the topic we should have discussed some 10, 20 years ago, because there are far bigger war crimes that are taking place against the Arabs and the Muslims than ever has happened, almost in the history of mankind, way back to Genghis Khan. Our main focus, I think, it should be on U.S. and Jewish war crimes in Palestine and Iraq. And if you look at what they have done to Iraq specifically, they're building walls around cities, they're turning them into concentration camps to where Treblinka, Dachau, and Auschwitz make little tiny dots in putting a whole country under siege. And that's what should be the focus I would like to see you point out to this audience what these people are doing, what they're doing to the Palestinians, what they're doing to the Israelis, what they have done to Lebanon. There should be an outcry around the world, not out here just sitting, talking about Semitism and anti-Semitism.
Well, I think you've just told the audience what you think they should know, and I'm happy that you did, but this is not the topic of my talk for this evening. I mean, I really wanted to speak about a more generalized sort of question with regards to the relationship of the Palestinians to the Israelis, which makes possible some of the crimes to which you might have alluded. So for me, again, I mean, diplomatic history is available for people to know, but I think we can also do a different kind of analysis, which I attempted to do this evening, that perhaps has a different focus from what you wanted. So.
They're destroying our whole culture.
Can you elaborate more on how Arabs have internalized this Semitism themselves?
Well, I mean, generally, even in sort of Arab sort of curricula and school textbooks and what have you, generally there's the presentation that Arabs are Semites. The same thing, of course, has become sort of have proliferated sort of in a Jewish self-identification, that people speak of themselves as Semites, out of the Semitic race or descendants. And of course, there's a kind of a religious gloss sometimes about the biblical or Quranic genealogy of terms like descendants of Sam. So ultimately, there's a kind of acceptance of this kind of philological, quasi-racial, or what becomes a racial designation that even Arabs would accept. And in fact, what Bernard Lewis was referring to is precisely what you might hear sometimes popularly in the press or in political debates, where some Arabs who are accused of anti-Semitism would say, well, how could we be anti-Semitic? We are Semites. So there's a declaration of accepting that Arabs are Semites and therefore that they could not be. And sometimes, very similar sort of logic and discourse is also produced by Jews in Israel or in the US or in France of speaking of themselves as Semitic. So it's a general internalization. It's an acceptance of this sort of myth produced in the late 18th century and concretized in the 19th century in racial type of thinking. Yeah.
Are Palestinian Christians Semites?
According to the philological studies, yes, of course, because it's not a religious issue. It's a racial or philological issue, right? As far as Renan was concerned, and those who followed him in the designation, right? So, of course, in that sense, the Palestinian Christians don't escape the Semitic fate, but actually inhabit it just the same way. So it's not religious. Remember, because religion unto itself was also a category that was becoming into a meaningful use as we understand it today only in the late 18th and sometimes people would argue in the 19th century. But still, sort of the transformation, there was the religious-based sort of anti-Jewish hostility in European, and certain periods of of certain areas of Europe in the history of those parts of Europe. But they were mostly based on a Christian kind of hostility to Judaism or to Jews as those who have refused to accept Christ as the Messiah. By anti-Semitism as a 19th century phenomenon is not about that. And the famous anti-Semites always made a distinction between the issue of religion, which of course can be overcome through conversion, and race, which cannot. But as race becomes culture, in a way, by the late 19th and early 20th century, the Zionist project understood that racialization won't work in Europe, right? And therefore, the only way to be able to do this project of becoming European or becoming Aryan, if you will, of viewing Jews in the very same way anti-Semitism views Jews, which is as people who, as a nation without a country, it must have a country, it must normalize, Zionism must normalize Jews, which was the term Zionism always used, i.e. they must be transformed into a normative European sort of model. And the only way to do this was nationalism. And those who were assimilationists in Europe were felt to be kind of naive because the Zionists claimed that this would not be allowed in Europe. We can do it, but we have to do it as colonials, as European colonials, carriers of Europeans' history and culture elsewhere in the world. And I think they were not actually very wrong or off the mark. Because remember, many of the countries, European countries, including the US, who refused to take in Jewish refugees, who had anti-Semitic policies at home and would not allow Jews to immigrate, are always very supportive of Israel. and support Israel because Israel for them is an example of a normalized condition of Jews. I mean, so the support of Israel and the hostility to Jewish immigrants or to Jewish populations in Europe are made up of the same kind of position, anti-Semitic position, of that which is Semitic or abnormal is other and therefore cannot be tolerated. And Israeli Jews can be tolerated because, of course, they emulate a form of life that's recognizably European, which is the nation form, and adopt a European culture that's also recognizable. And therefore, they were able to transcend their Semitic condition in a certain way. Yes?
Is the term anti-Semitism still a popular term outside the United States at this time, or do you see that only mentioned here in the U.S. by certain groups attacking professors like you who talk about these topics at certain corporate media outlets? Nowadays, pretty much here, anybody who is anti-Zionist or anti-Israeli occupation atrocities is called anti-Semite by default almost. Do you see that a problem worldwide or only here?
Well, no, it's also, I think, I mean, it's clearly a very much used term in Europe as well. Now, I mean, it's not only in the States, although perhaps you find it sort of more commonly used in the U.S. But no, I mean, the thing is, I mean, the amazing aspect of this is that Zionism has repudiated sort of Jewish history and Jewish culture as they existed in Europe. But now Zionism and its supporters want to claim that victimization as something that could happen to them, even though their very project was to repudiate Jewish cultures, Jewish languages, and create a new language that, for example, Jews had never spoken in the diaspora, such as Hebrew, which was only used for liturgical purposes, forsake sort of living Jewish languages like Yiddish, like Arabic, like Hakitiya, like Ladino, and adopt a new language, right? And of course, the idea was that I mean, this was not a kind of epiphenomenal aspect of Zionism, but actually Zionism was based on a kind of engineering, right? It spoke of the transformation or perhaps the creation of the new Jew, the Jew which is unlike the one that lived in Europe, who's not stamped by the experience of Jewishness and therefore anti-Jewishness. So Herzl was very clear that Jews caused anti-Semitism. He spoke in der Judenstaat. He would say how wherever Jews went, they carried anti-Semitism with them. He didn't blame them, but he didn't say that. He said they were responsible because they were not normal, and therefore the only way to end anti-Semitism is to actually end this non-normality of Jews, this abnormality of Jews, by transforming them into a people like all other peoples. And since, of course, Jews had been made a racial category, an ethnic category in the 19th century, and therefore a national category, nationalism seemed to him a very feasible project. The problem, of course, was that there is no land or country. So colonialism came in to help out with this project. Yes.
You talked about how Jews had become Europeans and Arabs became the Jews. Is this process seen along with Jews in Israel that are of Eastern European origin compared to the Jews of Arab countries? Is this like sort of that kind of discrimination?
Well, I mean, of course, I've written about that actually. It's a very important sort of procedure of what happened in Europe. I mean, in Israel. And basically, a lot of the anti-Semitism that you had from Christian Europeans toward Jews ultimately would be adopted by German Jews, who were the most secular and the most sort of assimilated, as in the way they represented East European Jews, what used to be called the Ostjuden. And then in Israel, ultimately, East European Jews would assimilate into Western forms of culture and use that very same representational sort of strategy to describe Jews from the Middle East, Arab Jews or Iranian Jews. But at the same time, I mean, what you have is, of course, a big identity crisis among Jews of Middle Eastern background in Israel. First of all, their pronunciation of Hebrew. They pronounce Hebrew with all the glottal stops and sounds that are sort of for the lack of a better word, native to Hebrew or part of Hebrew. And since European Jews could not pronounce any of these sounds and transformed the pronunciation of Hebrew into a form of German or Russian of sorts, the actual proper pronunciation of Hebrew that many of the Arab Jews exercised was seen as a wrong pronunciation and also as a mark of low culture and low civilization. So you would see a lot of assimilation by many Arab Jews to mispronounce, for example, the ayn or the hat when they speak Hebrew, to emulate European forms of mispronunciation as the proper and sort of more mobile, class-wise kind of pronunciation of Hebrew. The well-known Mizrahi activists, they're called Mizrahim, of course, Arab Jews and Iranian Jews. Sami Shoutrit, a political scientist who's of Moroccan background, an Israeli Jew of Moroccan background, and a poet, have written extensively on this question. And one of actually his poems, which was quite well known, speaks of the identity crisis of Arab Jews, where they would see their reflection in the mirror and were told to have to hate that reflection because they see the Arab when they look at the mirror and see themselves. And that's one of the explanations for some of the cultural attitudes that had been discerned and hostility that had been discerned by some groups, some among Arab Jews toward Palestinians and toward Arabs, a larger kind of self-hatred, because of course often they can be mistaken for Arabs by the Israeli police and had been historically. So it complicates the story further, of course.
Do you see Europe's attitude toward the state of Israel in backing Israel against the Palestinians or against the Arab? Is it, a step toward normalization of the Jews, or it is actually a continuation of the anti-Semitism?
Well, I mean, it's both, right? I mean, if for the Israelis, ultimately the project is to Europeanize, is to recreate themselves as a European society. The European society, exactly sort of as Sartre put it, right? If the Jew did not exist, the anti-Semite would have to invent him. There's this kind of binarism for identity to work. For sort of the architects of Israeli identity and culture, in large measure, I think the Palestinian is a necessity. As a Jew against whom one has to fight, as the primitive, as the parasite, remember the descriptions, for example, of Palestinians by Zionist ideologues is that Palestinians lived parasitically off the land. They were not, this was a desert that when the Jews as proper workers with a Protestant work ethic came in, worked the land and produced it. Whereas the Arabs, the Palestinians were just parasitical. Not unlike, of course, what Jews used to be called in Europe, on account of the anti-Semitic representation of Jews as only usurers and therefore living parasitically off European society and not being productive. So these kinds of parallels are actually, this is just one example of many of these types of this kind of representative strategy. So yes, I think on the psychological and or existential level, I do think the project of constantly fighting against the Palestinian as Semite is part of a project of Europeanizing yourself and making sure that you are European, and therefore, in that sense, anti-Semitic against those elements that you must externalize, those parasites, those primitives, those irrational people who are unable to be intelligible to civilized Occidentals like Israeli Jews have become, or have become.
All right. You mentioned briefly 1967. I was wondering if you could speculate about the extent to which the transformation of Jews into Europeans and Arabs into Jews might have been different if the outcome of 67 was different. Because of the role that Israel then took on for the Western world.
No, but I think that process had begun, of course, in 48, right? First of all, rendering Palestinians landless, right? Wandering Jews, so to speak, replicates the kind of history and the anti-Semitic descriptions of Jews as rootless, landless, and wandering. So in one sense, making Palestinians into refugees makes them into wandering Jews. Then inside 1948, the Palestinians who remained and Israel was not able to expel were, of course, placed under strict military laws, and they had passed laws for them. They couldn't leave their towns. There were sort of curfews. They couldn't work without a permit. They couldn't go from one town to another without a permit. They basically lived literally sort of besieged, almost in ghettos. Also not unlike many of the ghettos that European Jews lived in Europe as well. So in that sense, that process of transforming the Palestinian into the Jew had begun much earlier. And between 48 and 67, it was quite perfected. What happened after 67 is, of course, adding another subject population. So as a result, what you had is they relaxed slightly the military laws against Palestinians in Israel, making them transforming them into civil laws of discrimination. And Palestinians in Israel become sort of also like many Jews in more tolerant European countries in the 19th century. They became foreigners in their own land. And the Palestinians who are now besieged into ghettos were the ones in the West Bank and Gaza, and literally, as we see now, sort of walled in with a great wall staffed and manned by the Israeli army to make sure. And in some cases, like Jenin, they actually have a door and that they lock at night, and because the apartheid wall surrounds the entire city. So, the creation of that ghetto is a very interesting situation. But also some have speculated on the psychological aspect of Israel itself, sort of creating the country as a ghetto, surrounded by enemies, sort of forth. It could not, it replicated a certain form of life that it had in Europe by creating itself, by placing itself in a hostile environment wherein it is a colonial power. And therefore it did not produce a kind of a normal life, as we know. Israel failed the test of normality. It's a country constantly at war, constantly seeking to colonize other people's lands, constantly seeking to subject them. So in that sense, it's not really normal as Zionism had hoped it would become. It's constantly questioning itself and is being questioned on the kinds of policies that it enacts.
Right. Sorry, just to follow up. I was thinking more in terms of the political cover that was given to Israel because of its military success in 67 that allowed Israel to expand beyond what may have happened if 67 had gone differently.
You mean a kind of discourse in the West in terms of defending what Israel does or how it represents it or how it represents itself?
As a catalyst in terms of Israel being seen as a strategic military ally, which it wasn't before 67.
Yeah, it was an ally and a friend before 67, but after 67 there was a number of other things that happened, of course, which were of much value to the U.S. and to European countries. Recall from 48 to 67, France was the main military supplier of Israel, not the U.S. The U.S. was did supply, but not as much. And at some point, because the U.S. had was angry that the Israelis had gone with the French and the British to invade Egypt in '56, that was a no-no for the U.S. as a new superpower. So that was why it stopped Israel in its tracks and suspended the aid and forced Israel to withdraw from the Sinai. In '67, it was a much more important thing. The U.S. had been engaged in all kinds of low and high intensity warfare across the globe in the Cold War, trying to bring down popular regimes, as it had done, for example, to Sukarno in Indonesia in '65, to Nkrumah in Ghana, Chile in '73, Goulart in Brazil in '64. It tried to do the same thing with Nasser. With multiple attempts at coups, but was not successful. So when the Israelis actually were able to bring Nasser down, that was quite a big service that the U.S. had sought during the Cold War. I mean, yes, he remained president for 2 more years, but ultimately he was, as the American expression goes, a lame duck at that point and could not do very much. He was defeated, and this is a major, I think, achievement that the Israelis delivered to the Americans, and thus, in many ways, became a strategic ally. Yes.
Why don't you mention Palestinian terrorism when exploring Palestinian identity?
Well, because it depends on what you mean by terrorism. We get into
yourself up, or trying to go on buses and kill as many people as you can, or teaching your children and going to summer camps and teaching them how to kill people.
Of course, I would disagree, but I think perhaps also because I didn't mention much about Israeli terrorism, right? In the 1930s, the Jewish Zionist groups are the ones who introduced new kinds of terrorism to Palestine. For example, cafe bombings, car bombings, which were, of course, happened in several places, in Haifa, in Jaffa, in Jerusalem, throughout the 1930s.
Before,
I'm sorry?
About the Hebron massacre?
You mean in 1929? Mm-hmm. Yes, of course. Well, that's a horrible thing. But you're speaking about terrorism. The massacre was actually a pogrom of sorts.
The Jews were killed by
Yes,
who?
by Palestinians, yes, in 1929.
Before, right? This was before.
No. But there was, of course, all kinds of violence that happened from the 1880s, you see.
And Jews were killing Palestinians before they were attacked?
Would you like me to answer you? From the 1880s, you see, when the Zionist project started, it was started as a colonial project. And while after 1948, the conquest of the land would take place militarily, from the 1880s onwards, it didn't take place militarily, but by the force of money initially, and subsequently through the help of the British who came in 1919 and took over Palestine. So in the 1880s, when there was a colonial bank and all kinds of donations that went to the Jewish settlers to purchase land, the land that they purchased from absentee landlords, and it encompassed villages with Palestinian peasants that usually when these lands had changed owners, they did not expel the peasants. When the Jewish Zionists came in, they would buy the land and then kick the Palestinian peasants off the land and denying them any possible work on lands that they've worked for many, many years. As a result, that was the beginning of the resistance to these kinds of policies that actually dispossessed Palestinians of their lands. And by the beginning of the century, this continued sort of until the British arrived, violence would begin from 1921 with all kinds of demonstrations, all kinds of attacks, minor mainly. The 1929 issue of Hebron, of course, the victims of the Hebron massacre were, of course, Palestinian Jews who were Arab Jews and not the Zionist settlers. And this was, unfortunately, to the credit of Zionism, which convinced not only its supporters, but also its enemies, that it represented all Jews and it spoke for all Jews, when in fact it did not. That many of its actions against Palestinians came to be seen as actions by Jews and not by some Jews who espoused the Zionist line. And as a result, of course, this horrible sort of murder of Jews happened in Hebron. And of course, Palestinians also were killed in the mayhem. But still, basically Palestinian Jews in Hebron that had done nothing, of course, and were not supporters of Zionism, had been a victim of this massacre. But of course, to speak of numbers, I mean, there's no comparison in terms of the numbers, actually. There's at least 100,000 Palestinians who have been killed by the Zionist project since 1948 alone. While I, of course, oppose all Palestinian violent actions against any civilian Israelis, the numbers of civilian Israelis who were killed by Palestinian actions is negligible in comparison. I'm sorry?
The Israelis don't use their kids. They don't send their kids.
Because they're civilized, you think? Because they're civilized, the Palestinians are not?
Civilized.
So why do you think the Palestinians do?
It's just, I think that affects the number. If you're using your children, you're teaching your children to kill, what do you expect?
Well, I mean, I take exception to that kind of I think that's an underlying sort of a kind of a racist approach that Palestinians somehow don't value life the way Israelis do and teach their children.
Yes. See, ma'am, there are other people that like to ask questions. If you have questions, you can certainly pursue this afterwards, but please allow others to ask questions of the speaker.
All right. Yes, sir.
It was interesting how you mentioned the creation or the construct of Semitism implicitly creates the opposite. In terms of these notions of identity and how that's transcended to the shift towards the Arabs as well, what kind of responses would you say are formulating for any search of Palestinian identity, given all of the obstacles that we have now, in terms of being in enclaves and separated, in terms of what notions or what types of efforts are really being done to preserve that, or the challenges in preserving it?
You mean on a cultural level or
on a nationalistic level?
Well, it's very difficult, of course, because Palestinians have been separated now. They're into many groupings, at least four major sort of demographic bodies of Palestinians. Those who live in Israel itself as third-class citizens, in a country which has at least 20 laws that discriminate between Jews and non-Jews. Who are citizens of the country. Then you have those who live in the West Bank. And those, of course, have been divided into tens of different sort of ghettoized populations who can only move within their own enclaves and can't exit those enclaves. And, of course, in many of these towns, there are also curfews in the daytime when they can't move at all. You've probably seen sort of the checkpoints and what. So there's very little ability to kind of have the kind of communication that might have been possible before. Gaza, of course, now is also a separate kind of entity demographically and politically, and then, of course, diaspora Palestinians who live in, around the world, with concentrations in places like Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. But so, I mean, nonetheless, there's a kind of a cultural identity, I think, that has continued to prosper, whether it's in art, in literature, in music, which I think in many ways spans all these communities and in large measure is produced by, by all of them and consumed by all of them in a certain way with different focus. But I think at the moment, of course, a kind of, 2 days ago, there was a very interesting report about how Palestinians in the West Bank are resisting the draconian and racist sort of checkpoints where they have to sit for hours to be able to go in their own land from one place to another, because of the Israeli occupation. They've taken up to reading because they're there for hours. So there's now a whole network sort of that distributes books where people are just sitting there and read as they're waiting sort of for hours at the checkpoint. It's a new way of resisting, right? Under occupation, there were different cultural events, in addition, of course, to resistance in the form of demonstrations and in the form of writing. But there was also cultural events from, exhibits of paintings, of poetry readings. And these are all forms of resistance which also come into the formation of cultural identity. But again, I think a political project, I think, has been now in many ways on hold, given the continued assault on Palestinian lives, whether, in the different places where Palestinians live. So what unifies them, in a way, at this point is the kind of instability in their lives and the quest for a kind of stability and security, right, from the ravages that their lives endure on a daily basis. So I think there is no, especially with the collapse of the PLO, the collapse of Palestinian politics, the abduction of the remnants of the PLO as sort of part of the Israeli and the U.S. kind of agenda to dissolve the Palestinian question, the infighting between Hamas and Fatah has made it very difficult to actually articulate at any kind of elite level of politics a new cultural or a nationalistic project. So as a result, I think this has very much proliferated, and as it had always, always had, except that the PLO for a while in the late 60s, early 70s became a kind of mechanism to set up cultural bodies, such, especially for art and literature. Now they're gone, but I think Palestinians are still able to do these types, to produce these types of works to define who they have become and who they are, with difficulty, but I think continuously. So, I hope that answers it. Yes. Yes.
So perhaps now the Europeans can see the modern Jews as clean, civilized, and actually partners, like you mentioned, during the joint invasion of Egypt by England, France, and Israel. Wouldn't you say nonetheless that in the Arab world, at least, some portion of it still sees the modern Jews as the European Jews? I mean, it's very interesting when we look at the anti-Jewish cartoons and whatever, the old European stereotypes come back,
right,
and some portions of the Arab world use that again to their advantage. So how did that play in the whole picture?
Right. I mean, what's interesting, of course, and even someone like Bernard Lewis, who's a very strong sort of Zionist, acknowledges in his book on Semites and anti-Semites that certain forms of European anti-Semitism that have never been part of Arab cultural representations have seeped in the 20th century and ultimately have been used against in representations of Zionism and colonial Zionism. But I think they're not the main representative strategy. And certainly it was never the strategy by the Palestinians, especially, for example, the PLO has made an immense effort throughout the 60s and 70s to distinguish between Jews and Zionists. It was always, of course, Israel who insisted that Israel was a Jewish state. And the Palestinians always insisted that it was not. It was a Zionist state or a colonial settler state. So the Palestinian intellectuals and Palestinian politicians always insisted on the distinction between Jews and Zionists, and perhaps if you go back to Arafat's famous speech at the United Nations in 1974, it was a very important sort of message that that the Palestinian struggle was against the colonizing force, that had Zionism been Christian or Muslim or Hindu, Palestinians, of course, would have opposed it just as strongly. But I think the representation generally, I mean, Zionism is seen sometimes nationalistically as part and parcel of a history of conquests of Palestine, whether it's the Crusades, whether it's Ottomans for some, the British, or ultimately the European Jews. So it is actually seen in the context of European incursions, of foreign invasions of Palestine, which is, I think, more of the uniformly used representation. But yes, of course, in some ways, regrettably, some Arab regimes have used European sort of anti-Semitic representations of Jews completely borrowed from the European lexicon, and which had not been part at all historically of sort of the Arab tradition.
Going the other way, have we seen old ways of looking at Jews, perhaps from the 1700s or 1800s, have we seen those applied to Arabs and Muslims living in Europe now?
Yes, in large measure, yes, of course. I mean, the whole crisis of the presence of Arabs in France, of Turks in Germany, of Muslim, what is called Asians, mostly of South Asian background, what in the US we call South Asian, in Britain. Especially the Muslim segment of it, much of the representation is very much the same. The arguments about immigration. I mean, remember, Arthur Balfour, who is the author of the Balfour Declaration, which promised the Zionist movement Palestine as a national home, had been actually Minister of Immigration back in 1905 and had been the architect of the Immigration Act that made sure that Jews who were fleeing pogroms in Eastern Europe would not enter Britain. Right? So the same people who were and the language that was used to oppose East European Jewish immigration into Britain as communist subversives is not, of course, unlike the kind of language used today about Islamic terrorists, about sort of fanatics with new dangerous ideologies, and what have you. So this issue, especially in France and Britain, I think has been a big issue, and the representative strategy is, I think, in large measure borrowed from anti-Semitic representations. One last question. Yes, sir.
I understand the construct of the word anti-Semitism, but I'm just wondering, I mean, how we defeat that. If you know, what am I? Am I an anti-Semite, or am I anti-Zionist, or am I anti-Israel, or am I anti-colonialist, or I mean, they use this term so easily to describe all of us as anti-Semites, and you know, we seem helpless to defend.
When you say they, you mean those who supporters of Israel?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think I'm hoping that in tonight's lecture I had tried to at least unpack the term a bit for us to see what kind of history it has had and what kinds of uses it can be put to. Clearly, I agree. I mean, there's a whole lobbying strategy that tries to delegitimize any attack, any criticism of Israel as to be seen as an attack on Jews. But of course, for me, it is the anti-Semites are those who think that anyone who criticizes Israel is an anti-Semite. Because, of course, when you criticize Israel, you're criticizing the Israeli government and Israeli policies. You're not criticizing Jews. Only those who reduce Israel to Jews, they are the anti-Semites. So anyone who thinks that attacking Israel is anti-Semitic is the anti-Semite, because those people think that Israel represents all Jews. I don't believe Israel represents all Jews. The majority of Jews around the world have not elected Israel to speak for them, have not supported it. As we know, even at least half of America's Jews have never even been to Israel, nor want to go. And the other half who've gone to visit have gone to visit and on a tour of Jordan and Egypt and of the Middle East, and not a specific sort of visit to the country. So, I mean, Zionism in that sense, of course, has failed to garner the support of the majority of the Jews of the world. Remember, I mean, basically Zionism was able to establish a state because the majority of the Jewish population that it received were refugees who nobody else wanted to take. The majority of European Jews who survived the Holocaust did not want to go to Israel. Many tried to come to the US, who would not take them. Many tried to go back to their own homes, and they were attacked by anti-Semites in their own small villages in Poland or elsewhere. So So ultimately, most of the Jewish population who ended up in Israel ended up there not because they supported Zionism, but because they had no other place to go. So Zionism, in large measure, failed miserably at recruiting the majority of Jews. And today, of course, it still has a minority of the world Jews in its country, because the majority of Jews who may care about it, may support some of its policies, are not Zionists. They don't want to live there. 10 million strong around the world, American Jews, Argentinian Jews, Russian Jews, the majority of Russian Jews who wanted to come to the U.S., Israel made sure that they would no longer get all kinds of visas to the U.S. and Western Europe, and many ended up having no choice but to go there. And as you know, half of the so-called 1 million Russian Jews who went there, possibly two-thirds, it depends on the different studies that are out there, were actually Christian and not Jews. They're economic refugees trying to get out of Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. So in that sense, I think we have a ready answer for anyone who thinks our criticism of the Israeli government is in any way anti-Semitic. As you could see from the lecture tonight, it is in defense of the Jewishness of Jews against the onslaught of anti-Semites, whether Zionists or not. These are the people who want to reduce Jews to Israelis and Zionists. They want to make Jewish life center on Israel, which it never was and continues not to be. This is the struggle that Israel and its defenders want to impose. Mostly, I mean, what they want to have control over are the Jewish communities around the world, which is why they want to control this kind of discourse.